Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Paul Golan. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and this is the third in our ongoing series of Life, the Universe, and Humanistic Judaism, where we get to hear from our clergy and leaders who all have very interesting expertise areas, and I thought this would be a great opportunity for our members to hear about it and get to meet some of the really, I think, fascinating people who are involved in our movement. And this is exclusively for members, so you are members either of in-person affiliated communities of SHJ or independent members, which we have all over the world, and we're happy to be able to welcome people from across the oceans. The one good thing that came out of pandemic is we're able to connect through this technology, so that's really wonderful. And I'm thrilled that you are all here today because we're going to talk about something which I'm certainly interested in. I think most people are, which is music. And we're honored to have with us Cantor Dr. Jonathan Friedmann. Can I say Cantor Doctor? That's a thing, right? So let me briefly read his bio. Cantor Dr. Jonathan Friedmann is a leading voice in humanistic Judaism and renowned scholar of Jewish music. He has been leading congregational services and directing and teaching in Jewish educational programs throughout the Los Angeles area for over a decade. Jonathan has published hundreds of articles on musicology and the sociology of religion, as well as over 24 scholarly books. Jonathan received cantorial ordination and a master's in Jewish sacred music from the Academy for Jewish Religion, California, where he is now professor of Jewish music history and associate dean of the Master of Jewish Studies program. He holds BA and MA degrees in religious studies from California State University, Long Beach, and a PhD in Hebrew Bible from the Joint Doctoral Program of Northwest University and Greenwich School of Theology. Jonathan is also president of the Western States Jewish History Association and director of the Jewish Museum of the American West. So thank you for being here and welcome, Jonathan. I'm going to turn it over to you for a bit. I have some questions afterwards, and then we will open it up to Q&A for folks. So if you hear something that you want to ask a question about, either write it in the chat or keep it in your mind, and we will have time for Q&A. So welcome again, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Paul. Great seeing you and everyone here. This is, of course, a topic that is near and dear to me, and I think we all love music, like you're saying, if we are normal people, if that's an inappropriate word to use. But when we get into the weeds of what makes something Jewish and what makes, as an example, music Jewish, I think it becomes not only more complicated than we assume, but also, I hope, more interesting. So that's my intention today, to make this topic, which I think we know a little bit about, maybe a little more interesting. So many years ago, my late mentor, Cantor William Charlin, was invited to present on the topic of Jewish music at a synagogue, where he opened with what sounded like a standard Jewish liturgical song. But after finishing, he asked the audience to name that tune, and they just couldn't do it. And it turned out that he was singing the melody of Gustav Mahler's Songs of the Wayfarer. So Cantor Charlin's point was that the Hebrew language has the transformative power to make almost any melody sound Jewish. There's a common saying in Jewish musicology, the academic study of Jewish music, that not all music made by Jews is, by that fact alone, Jewish. But what about Hebrew pop songs from Israel? They could be about anything: falling in love, losing your keys, kicking a rock, but the Hebrew language makes it sound Jewish to us. And the same can be said for Yiddish songs, Ladino songs. And let's not forget that English is also a Jewish language. In America alone, there are over 7.5 million Jews who use English on a daily basis. And really what makes a language Jewish is that Jews are speaking it. And some of those Jews might sing songs about falling in love, losing their keys, and kicking rocks. And are those songs any more or less Jewish than those of their Israeli counterparts. So getting back to the Songs of the Wayfarer example, Mahler originally composed that piece of music in 1885, over 10 years before he converted to Catholicism. And according to Jewish law, even when someone like Mahler, who was born to a Jewish mother, converts to another religion, he's still Jewish anyway. So was Songs of the Wayfarer perhaps in some sense Jewish to begin with? And well, it depends on who you ask, which is probably what makes Jewish music Jewish. 2 Jews, 3 opinions, and that sort of thing. So Cantor Charlin concluded his presentation with a rather Zen-like answer to the question of what is Jewish in Jewish music. Nothing and everything. So here are some examples of why this isn't such a straightforward topic. Here's a tune I grew up singing in a Reform synagogue for a prayer of peace. Sim shalom, sim shalom, tova, tova, uveracha. It wasn't until studying music in college that I discovered this melody was taken from a Latin Mass folk tune, which is also about granting peace. Dona nobis pacem, pacem, dona nobis pacem. But learning this fact didn't make that melody any less Jewish to me. And how about this melody? Da 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 da. I don't think anyone would argue against its inherent Jewishness, even though it's primarily derived from a Romanian folk song, Carul cu boi, the ox-driven cart. And how about this song? I'm a little teapot, short and stout. Here is my handle, here is my spout. If you turn that minor, it sounds like this. Da 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 da. Da, 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 da. It's basically Hatikva. So, and by the way, George Harold Sanders, who wrote the Little Teapot Melody in the 1930s, was probably Jewish, or at least his wife was, and their son, journalist Ronald Sanders, identified as Jewish. So getting back to the idea of the Jewish in Jewish music being nothing and everything, I think it's important to acknowledge that Jewish is itself a very difficult word to define, and no single definition will work in every case. And likewise, music is a very difficult term to define. No single definition will work in every case. So there's a problem. Jewish music combines an adjective, Jewish, and a noun, music, implying that there's something inherently or exclusively Jewish about the music itself. But really, we have an ambiguous adjective describing an ambiguous noun. So to me, what nothing and everything, this formula means, is that there's really nothing inherently Jewish about the music itself, only conventions and assumptions of Jewishness that maybe develop over time. In fact, the defining characteristic of music we identify as Jewish is its close musical similarities to music of surrounding peoples. Yet everything about the music can be Jewish if it's used or understood in a Jewish way, however we might define that. And this leads us to an approach that some musicologists prefer, a functionalist rewording of Jewish music as music of the Jews, or music of the Jewish people. That is, music that is used for Jewish purposes, used by Jews, that sort of thing. But this is meant to exclude certain types of music, music that is not strictly meant to accompany Jewish activities or convey obviously Jewish words or ideas, but does it exclude in the way that it intends? What's a Jewish activity? What's a Jewish purpose? Does the music need to have specifically Jewish text or context? What about subtext? The underlying theme or unspoken subject matter that maybe makes something like Irving Berlin's White Christmas arguably a Jewish Christmas song. By the way, when anyone asks me what my favorite Jewish song is, I say White Christmas. Not only to get a rise out of them, but there's some truth to that. So when I was a kid going to B'nai Mitzvah parties, it was standard practice to get on the dance floor and gesture along to the village people's YMCA. And it wasn't the YMHA, right? It was the YMCA. And to me, that song, because of that context, because of my experience with it, that song will always be a Jewish piece of music to me. So my career as a musician really began with a group called Rabbinical School Dropouts. This was an esoteric space klezmer ensemble, as we used to call it, that was active in the late 90s and early 2000s. And we mixed up all kinds of musical styles, from funk to Latin to psychedelic to free jazz to classical, under a loosely constructed and loosely defined klezmer umbrella. And I was interviewed in those days in the foreword or the tablet, I don't remember which, but when they asked me what made the music that I wrote Jewish, I answered with the sarcasm of someone in his 20s. Well, I'm Jewish, so everything I do is Jewish. Now, over the years, I've come to agree more and more with this, at the time, flippant statement. So, what about humanistic Jewish music? Well, if we're seeking to understand humanistic Jewish music, I think it's a little bit easier because it's music that we understand to be filtered through a specific philosophy and used for specific occasions. Namely, this is from the SHJ website, humanistic Judaism celebrates Jewish life without religious prayer or appeals for divine intervention, instead putting faith in ourselves and our fellow humans as the best vehicles for improving the world. So the music needs to be filtered through this filter, as it were. In my own experience, there are 7 main sources of music for humanistic Jewish gatherings. First are familiar texts and melodies that happen to be humanistic, despite coming from theocentric or theistic sources, such as Ma Tovu from the Book of Numbers, Hine Ma Tov from the Book of Psalms, or Lo Yisagoy from the books of Isaiah and Micah. Second would be prayer songs with modified lyrics to make them more humanistic, such as the rewording of Oseh Shalom as Naaseh Shalom, we will make peace, and the Shema as Shema Yisrael, Echad Aminu, Adam Echad, Hear, O Israel, our people is one, humanity is one. Third are select Jewish folk songs and old favorites, sometimes reinterpreted with more overtly humanistic meanings like Tum Balalaika or Am Yisrael Chai. And fourth are popular Israeli songs with thoughtful, uplifting, or nostalgic appeals, such as Zum Gali Gali and Hava Nagila. A fifth source are relevant songs from American musicals and popular music like Somewhere Over the Rainbow from The Wizard of Oz or I Won't Back Down from Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. A sixth source would be Nigunim, wordless songs, songs sung with what musicologists call nonsense syllables. And some of these might preserve familiar liturgical melodies, but just take the words out completely, like the High Holiday melody. You still get the same feelings without the words. And seventh are songs original to humanistic Judaism, such as the movement's anthem, Eifo Ori, Where is My Light, with lyrics by Rabbi Sherwin Wine. But can anything become a humanistic Jewish song if we want it to be and make the necessary modifications? Perhaps. Remember, what makes Jewish music Jewish, and by extension, humanistic Jewish music humanistic Jewish, is nothing and everything. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think it's going to give people a lot to think about. And again, if folks have questions, keep them handy or put them in the chat and we will get to them. But I have a bunch of questions. And first of all, I love when you said that YMCA is Jewish because you heard it at every bar mitzvah. And I'm just going to add to that list We Are Family by Sister Sledge and Celebration by Kool and the Gang, because it's literally at every simcha I've gone to. And why not? And then, Black Eyed Peas then did that song where they say Mazel Tov in it. And it's like they knew. They're like, if we do that, if we throw in a Mazel Tov, this song is going to be played for eternity at bar and bat mitzvah. So I love it. I think that claiming it as Jewish is a very humanistic thing to do, right? Because, as you kind of quoted, we get to decide. And so I really appreciate that. And one thing I did want to ask you, so, and folks should know that the kind of structure that you just laid out for us will be in chapter form in a book that our movement is working on, a collaborative book with the rabbis and cantors in our movement that will come out, I think, at some point this year or next. But I got to read a sneak peek of that chapter, and it got me thinking a bit because my wife is not Jewish, so I got to experience Jewish community through the lens of a newcomer. And one of the things she said to me fairly early on, after going to a couple of bar mitzvah services, not the party, but the actual like conservative or reform b'nai mitzvah, is she said, "Why is every Jewish song sad?" And I said, "This is one of the happy ones," right? When she told me that, it was like one of the happy ones. And then I love seeing in this chapter that's forthcoming, you wrote the fact that some of the best known, quote, happy songs in the Ashkenazic corpus use minor scales, Havenu Shalom Aleichem, Siman Tov Mazel Tov, Chanukah O Chanukah, etc., tell us that minor is not always sad and that tempo can be more important than tonality in conveying musical moods. So are you saying that they're not all sounding sad, or you get to decide what sounds sad? When she said it did, I think it's a valid point.
Well, yeah, tempo is the it factor when we're talking about what makes something feel happy or sad or other shades of emotions. So you could take an example like Havenu Shalom Aleichem and slow it down. Havenu Shalom Aleichem, and it becomes the saddest song you ever heard in your life. So it's more about preferences for tonality. Certainly the minor in sort of the abstract doesn't have the same negative valence that it might have in sort of conventional Western music, but tempo is a major factor.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I have a feeling everything was being sung slowly at these we went to. So you touched on growing up in a reform community, right? And then the school that you went to is affiliated with the reform movement. Is that?
It's trans-denominational.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was your journey from growing up in the reform Jewish movement to humanism? When did you hear about it, and when did you kind of declare yourself? And was it before or after cantorial school? And what was the experience like, perhaps knowing that you're humanistic and being in that pluralistic setting?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I had the benefit of growing up in the reform movement in the 80s when God talk wasn't really a big emphasis at that time. And, we would learn Bible stories, but I always just thought of them as mythology, and I wasn't told to really or forced to see them in any other way. So it was always kind of, God as a character, more so than a theistic kind of education, at least the way that I received it. And at home, it didn't even come up, the subject. I'm assuming my parents were as atheist as I was. And that's part of the puzzle. I mean, I've been an atheist since birth. I've never not been, so I don't know what it's like not to be. So humanism is another layer, of course, because that's a positive philosophy as opposed to a negative theological statement. But in terms of my own upbringing, I can remember certain moments, such as being in kind of a weekend Jewish camp, and there were two counselors who were brothers who were debating with each other whether you could be Jewish and not believe in God. And one of them said you couldn't, and the other one said you could. And I was listening to them with confusion. Am I at a Christian camp? Do Jews even believe in God? It just wasn't a part of my consciousness. So I think what appealed to me about humanism, I really discovered it after finishing cantorial school, learning the various modes of Jewish thought, but really more in the theistic sphere. So Reconstructionist, Renewal, Orthodox, Conservative, etc. I had a pretty good understanding of all that. And I felt like kind of an outsider, maybe as an anthropologist to the experience, kind of viewing how this resonates with others, but never really feeling it as my own. And then I answered an advertisement for a instructor for adult education at our local humanistic congregation. And it was through that experience that I kind of learned about humanistic Judaism. So, I mean, that's an experience that's probably shared by many. Your first exposure to it is through a community, because it's not the most well-known, unfortunately, movement out there. So that's sort of how it evolved.
Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah, tomorrow.
Right. But that's fascinating, and it's so what, you hadn't heard of humanism yet, but what was it that kind of drove you to decide to study and become a cantor?
Well, that's another story, and I've thought about this before, and I guess I'm already on the record with this particular answer, so I'll stick to it. And that answer is boredom. If I'm being completely honest. So, growing up in this reform environment, having to sit through services that I didn't care about very much, particularly the high holidays, as sort of the, ancestral obligation, as it were, more than anything else. I would fall asleep, I would be distracted, and I thought to myself, hey, I'm kind of a musician. Maybe I can just join the choir and be on the other side of this event, and at least I'll have like a sheet of music or like a menu of the service that I can look at and check the boxes mentally and know when the service is going to end. And I'll at least be a participant instead of a bored person trying to stay awake in the congregation. So really, it was through that inspiration of boredom that I got caught up in the music and started to learn it and appreciate it and research the composers. And that was a sustaining force in my life. I was a Reformed cantor for 16 years at a good sized Reformed congregation. But there was a certain point where even that musical interest kind of wore off. And then I realized something that I already knew, which is I don't really believe when I'm leading people. Maybe some of them believe it. I don't know if all of them do. But what are we doing here? What am I doing here? I started to have that kind of, I guess, existential questioning of myself.
Fascinating. So as you know, and as folks who are joining us may or may not know, we have such an incredible diversity of kinds of communities, even in our small movement, where some of them, like the founding community out in suburban Detroit, looks like a suburban synagogue, and there's a rabbi and there's a bima. They don't call it a bima, but it's a bima. And ranging down to communities that are a couple of dozen people who gather, informally with no professional staff at all. And along those lines, first of all, they all do music, but the way they do music varies wildly, and in both uh, style and, I hate to say it, quality. So, what would you recommend to communities that don't have a cantor or don't even have professional staff, but are getting together to do humanistic liturgy and that always includes some kind of singing? Like, how can they make it good if nobody in the room is professional? Or can
Yeah,
they?
I mean, so there's a whole other side of like music philosophy about what makes music good, or and part of it is it's going to be good in the sense of feeling right and um, fulfilling if it's sincere. So people who maybe don't pride themselves as singers or musicians can make a good musical experience just by being themselves and making sound. And singing is a very healthy activity. It's very uplifting. But if you're thinking about like, what do we do if we don't have an accompanist? Or what do we do if we don't have someone who's really capable of leading us in melody? It is perfectly okay to sing along with recordings. So you can have someone there who plays, the different tracks for the service, and you sing along with that. You're still getting all the benefits of singing together and all the, connection and everything else that comes from that. But somebody is leading you sort of by proxy in a way, right? Through that. So, I mean, I haven't seen that done personally, but I don't think there's any problem with doing that. And it could actually be a very beneficial solution if that's a problem.
I like that. One other thing I was thinking that I just kind of want your feedback or maybe affirmation on is singing together as a group rather than a performative thing if the performers are not performers. If only they have deemed themselves the talent, and like, wouldn't it be better if everyone? Because I like the idea. I'm thinking, for example, the song "Imagine," which does get airtime in our movement because the lyrics are perfect for us. It's not necessarily an easy song for folks to sing a cappella. So I love the idea of like playing the music and just but have everyone sing together, right? I mean, isn't there a
Mhm.
benefit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think particularly in our movement, which does value the individual and the dignity of everyone in the group, it's only right for the music to be collective, even more so than in other Jewish communities where that's kind of the trend and the norm, much to the chagrin of cantors who spend their lives studying all the fancy stuff. People just want to sing the sing along stuff, right?
Yeah,
But I think it's an expression of our philosophy actually to have that group singing experience.
that's awesome. I see a couple of good questions in the chat, but let me ask my last one, which is it's not a question, it's a statement. You have a podcast, and I see the logo behind you. So can you tell folks a little bit about Amusing Jews?
Yeah, well, you should know because you were one of our guests.
Okay, I didn't want to.
Music, one of my favorite episodes. Um, yeah, Amusing Jews is an interview show celebrating Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. It's hosted by me and former student, now colleague of mine, Rabbi Joey Angelfield. And yeah, we interview people from all walks of entertainment life, from the obvious to the not so obvious. So it's not just actors and comedians. And, what we think of as amusing in our program is a much broader term of, encompassing entertainment. It could be enjoyable, it could be thought-provoking, it could be interesting. So we've had memoirists and we've had documentarians and so forth who aren't necessarily doing funny stuff, but it's amusing in the broader sense of bringing entertainment and really high quality content into our lives. And, part of it is not such a secret that Jews are involved in the entertainment world, but, getting to know these people and presenting these interviews to the world on YouTube and through the podcast, in some ways, we hope will chip away at some anti-Semitism. I mean, part of the role of, our work, I think, is presenting a positive image of Jews to the greater world. And, if we learn that video games, home video game systems were invented by Jews, or that the shopping cart was invented by a Jew, or whatever the subject may be, then maybe Jews aren't so bad.
Good luck ending anti-Semitism. So a couple of questions in the chat. So Martin, who is in London area, I believe, in England, writes about a uniquely British Jewish desire for authenticity, which, by the way, I don't think it's just British. I think a lot of people all over the world who grew up in a different setting than humanistic Judaism think that there's a right way to do it, and then they label it authenticity. Desire for authentic liturgy sung in Hebrew, and they have an aversion for English because that, of course, seems less authentic. Do you have any advice around how to continue appealing to people who are non-theistic but want this authenticity as they see it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a challenge I think, in all communities. Sometimes it's generational. Sometimes it's where you came from to get to humanistic Judaism. There's some, grief even involved when someone who grew up conservative, loving the music, loving the experience, perhaps, and reciting the words or as sounds, really, not necessarily understanding what they mean or believing what they are, but loving those sounds. And then you go into a community that's much more actually authentic in the sense of needing to say what you believe and not just say what is given to you because it's given to you. And I think that's where the tension comes. So salvaging melodies, very well-known melodies like Avinu Malkeinu or what have you. And, there are humanistic versions of those. Maybe they're in English. Maybe you can do it yourself or get someone else to turn it into Hebrew. So at least you're, preserving that very special sound. Because I think it is when we talk about authenticity or tradition or what is genuine versus not, we're really talking about a feeling. So it's about preserving a feeling of whatever authenticity means to you. And for a lot of people, it is the age-old melodies that you want to keep, even though you can't really keep the words. And there's a long history of this. Kol Nidre, for instance, was tossed out of the Reform movement in Europe in the 19th century, and there were attempts to replace it with German hymns and other alternative pieces of liturgy, etc. But ultimately, the melody survived. It survived so strongly that it was just presented as a melody, so on the organ or another instrument. And then eventually, by the late 20th century, the Reform movement decided to include, as it were, the text of Kol Nidre, because that text has a long and difficult history. If you look at anti-Semitism and the idea of you can make promises and then you don't have to keep them, and that being used as a proof text that Jews can't be trusted, not understanding the poetic nature of that non-prayer. It's not even a prayer if we're being technical, but nevertheless, I mean, it's one of those things where that melody or the melodic structure of Kol Nidre, it's really not just one melody. It's a bunch of different melodies that sound similar. But nevertheless, preserving that was so strong, that sense of preservation, that eventually it came back. So I guess my point is trying, when possible, to preserve those signature tunes, Maut Sur, perhaps, whatever it might be, but play around with the text. We have that ability within humanistic Judaism to not be so traditionalist that we cannot change the words. The words are the first thing we can change. The melody is sometimes more difficult to get rid of.
That's great. Thank you. And Rachel asked this related question, and she says she's new to humanistic Judaism, which is exciting, so welcome. Is there a siddur or collection of humanistic Jewish prayers and songs available? And I know the answer is there's many, and there will never be just one, because we couldn't. We just can't. We have amazing autonomy, and also individuality in our movement that we celebrate, even if it can sometimes look like anarchy. So maybe we celebrate the anarchy too. But and I'll put a link in the chat to the liturgy book that SHJ did a few years ago for our organization's 50th anniversary. And as you're saying, you know, the tune can stay the same, and there are versions of the liturgy as well. But are there things that you want to point to as far as collection of humanistic Jewish prayers and songs?
Yeah, you know, as you're saying that, I know that not only are our communities autonomous, anarchistic in some sense, you know, that kind of thing. I know that in my particular community in Los Angeles, it's kind of a congregation in my own image. I mean, I'm happy that other people share in that image, and certainly I listen, and but ultimately I've been given the honor and privilege of kind of piecing it together myself. So I don't personally consult a lot of other materials in putting together my own musical catalog. But I know that over the years, people in the SHJ have sent out PDF collections of different things. I know those are out there. I know I have them somewhere in my computer, but it is more of a kind of a collective process of people saying, how about this? And how about this? And sort of cobbling it together as opposed to a printed volume.
Yeah. And SHJ's Rabbi Miriam Jarris just put a link in the chat to sheet music because someone had asked about sheet music.
Yeah.
And yeah, and look, I think it would be great if we were able to put some more of this out there. You know, I remember hearing Afo Ori for the first time at the Birmingham Temple years before I was working for Humanistic Judaism. And, you know, I see some of the comments are, you know, because I also see Martin just mentioned that, you know, some in the reform movement in the UK are upset about hearing musical instruments, right, on Shabbat. And I grew up in the conservative movement. And I remember when I was going to intermarry, and I knew that the conservative movement was not the movement for me anymore. I knew that when I was 12, but once it was official and I was looking for a place to get married, we went to Temple Emmanuel on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, which not only is classic reform, it's like a two-story organ in the back, you know, and coming with my biases, I heard this organ and I heard a choir that you couldn't see because it's supposed to be the voices of angels. And I thought, this is church. But my wife is like, this is what religion is supposed to be like.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, sold, right? Because we wanted a rabbi and I was unfamiliar at the time fully with humanistic Judaism. And the space is gorgeous and so on. So, and the music was great. It takes some getting past the biases you grew up with, and it's remarkable how persistent that is in the Jewish community, because you can always go find someone to the right of you who's telling you that you're doing it wrong, you know, that's not how we do it. So to kind of let all of that go takes a little bit of work for folks who grew up with it, but it's so liberating to just be like, you know, do what you find meaningful. I'm trying to there's a lot of good comments, but I'm trying to see if there's other questions. And maybe at this point we can take off the spotlight and just allow people to ask questions by unmuting themselves. Does anyone have a question I didn't see that wants to unmute themselves and ask? Or just a comment? Oh, Eva, I saw that you did write something and then I lost it in the scroll. Do you wanna say what you wrote?
Okay, so I've been writing a lot of music, and so have people at Arenu, to old liturgical tunes, and sometimes Sandy will write beautiful new tunes, and that is familiar to us oldies. And so it attracts a lot of people when they come to our services. Oh, that's familiar. Oh, this is nice. Because as we know, people very often come for the musical stuff. But I'm finding that with younger people today, that's not going to be so familiar to them. And a lot of the cantors today are making up songs that are, to me, incredibly boring, like when I go to a Reformed service. So how do we write our music, our songs to really popular, modern, youthful pieces of music and still get ready permission? Because getting permission to publish our songs to popular music is practically impossible. It's so expensive. So how can we write it to music that is really in the popular youthful? I'm trying to attract the youthful people, 20 and under 40. That's my question.
Yeah, it's difficult because musical tastes change very rapidly. I think, all forms of Jewish life, humanistic included, tend to be more conservative in their practice than the popular culture, meaning that, musically speaking, the music of Debbie Friedmann, which is now 50 years old, is still contemporary Jewish music in the synagogue, right? And in the broader world of popular music, that is 50 years old music that is not on the radio anymore. If people even listen to radios anymore. I think the challenge with youthful music is that hip hop is such a ubiquitous. This isn't a problem, generally speaking. There's nothing wrong with hip hop, but hip hop is such a ubiquitous presence in the pop culture now, and all ethnic and racial demographics, etc. I think bringing hip hop into the synagogue would be the most contemporary thing to do, the most youthful thing to do. But I think that those kids who listen to it would also hear us doing it as pretty dorky, right? So, and I think it would be very disingenuous, and it wouldn't work. And I wouldn't try it. But to that point, I think there are like perennial favorites, and the real classics and the real, meaning or definition of classic is stuff that was maybe never new and it never gets old, that kind of thing. It's always there. The Beatles, for instance. Every generation, even my kids who are teenagers, every generation discovers the Beatles. It's kind of remarkable. Their last album was released in 1970, and they're still current. So I think the key is maybe finding music that is cross-generational as opposed to music that is specifically for the trends of today. Because the trends of today are forgotten tomorrow, and yet there are certain things that last. So the key really is trying to figure out, across generations, grandparents, parents, children, what they can all kind of agree on, as opposed to trying to cater to one generation. That's been my experience. And the other thing is, the thing about tradition, which is a word that we like to use a lot as Jews, that just means usage plus time, right? It's a fancy word for basically using something over and over again for a duration of time. That's all it is. So you can create a tradition within your community. If people come enough times, if they come 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times, those melodies that seem unfamiliar or not attractive or whatever at first becomes their melodies through the experience. So another way to think about it is, instilling a sense of humanistic Judaism through these particular melodies. That is a grounding force for even a young person's identity. So the music may automatically appeal to someone like you or me, the melody for Avinu Malkeinu or whatever, which might not be as familiar to younger people, but if they do it enough, it becomes their melody too, if that makes sense. Because it wasn't new when we learned it either. It was already a few hundred years old by the time I first heard Avinu Malkeinu. So, there's some tension there. I fully recognize that, but I think there are more kind of sustainable ways of looking at it that don't focus on just doing the music of today, which becomes the music of yesterday.
That's great, and I appreciate that, and I understand about recording or publishing, but if you're in a group, you can sing a Beatles song, right? I mean,
Yeah, absolutely. You're not making money.
I know Paul McCartney's a little aggressive about protecting his properties, but I don't think he's going to come after any of our communities. And the reason why I actually had mentioned AFO Ori was the feeling I had the first time I heard it, which was I felt ignorant. And so it's weird because for the people singing it, what I recognized immediately, again, having grown up in the conservative movement, in my youth, the thing that got the whole congregation roused up was the Shema, right? That was the one thing that everyone sang together and emotionally. And then I saw it happen at the Birmingham Temple for AFO Ori, and the Shema, of course, was not included at all, or maybe there was a humanistic one, but it didn't have the same impact. And I said to myself, okay, this is these people's Shema. And I don't know it, and I didn't know that I would learn it, and that one day it would have the same emotional impact for me that it has for the people who were saying it at that time. And you're right, though, that because I've done it and it now has meaning for me, it has meaning. But if I had walked in and I had felt like an outsider and then never came back, then you don't have that. And so to have a mix of songs where if they had also done Imagine, that like we do a secular Seder with a secular student alliance, and the last couple of years have included Bob Marley song, which again is 50 years old, but I think Bob Marley is almost there with the Beatles as far as each generation kind of discovers that music, and to throw in those kind of things so people who are there for the first time have something to grab onto and say, okay, I know this one. I see what you're doing with it. I appreciate it. I think it would be nice to kind of have that mix. And then they'll come back, and then you can bring them along on the AFO Oris. So I see Shirley's hand up, and then Samantha. Shirley.
Yes, I'm going to talk a minute about, the question of authenticity, how Jewish this music is, I think can't be disputed when it comes to Yiddish music, because it was composed by a Yiddish composer and the lyrics are in a Jewish language. And I've succeeded in incorporating a lot of those songs into our holiday celebrations. But I worry about how relevant it is to, as we were talking about, younger people. I mean, I'm not one of the Yiddishists that think we can revive Yiddish. I love Yiddish, but I know it's basically a language that's going to be only studied by scholars in the future and the Hasidim. But it is so authentically Jewish, at least to me, that I would hate to see it disappear. And then this is just a side thing. There's a very wonderful chorus in New York called the Jewish People's Philharmonic Chorus that only sings in Yiddish. But what they've done recently is take songs like Old Lang Syne and translate it into Yiddish, and I find that ridiculous.
Any response?
Yeah, I don't know if there was a question there, but I absolutely agree that, for a lot of us with, our shared ancestry, Yiddish is this beautiful resource that we should be able to tap into. I think, there's Duolingo out there now where you can learn Yiddish. I'm actually doing it. So, and it's pretty fun. It helps to have a German background, but nevertheless, it's a very fun activity that I think kids, if you incorporate that into your Sunday school curricula, or have some kind of incentive for kids to do Duolingo Yiddish, that's one way to make it fresh and make it kind of in a participatory, active engagement with culture. Because ultimately, Yiddish is not just a language; it's a state of mind. It's there's Yiddish land. Wherever people spoke Yiddish, it was their own place, and it's a feature of a culture. And the thing about losing a language like Yiddish is you lose the whole culture. So, and it's very, very fertile and very evocative once you get into it. So I think it would appeal perhaps to younger people if we do expose them to more Yiddish than we maybe assume, right? Because I think there is that assumption. is it going to connect to them in the same way? Probably not. Is it going to, is it going to resonate with them, or is it going to just sound old-fashioned? We have these questions, but do we actually experiment? I think if we experimented a little bit more with bringing Yiddish into the fold, we might be surprised.
And I also just want to gently push back on the idea of singing modern songs in Yiddish. I think it's a great opportunity. I think it's a way to get the language in front of people who know the songs. So we had a community in Sarasota with a choir that sang in Yiddish, and it was emotional for a lot of people, including myself, because I don't know Yiddish, but my grandmother, it was her first language. And so it brought me back. But I left that community thinking, because they were doing traditional songs, the song in my mind that I wanted them to do was "You Can't Always Get What You Want" by the Rolling Stones, because first of all, that is a song sung by a choir. And I just thought, if that was in Yiddish, we could do a music video with that, and people would I think, love that. And just the phrase "you can't always get what you want" sounds Jewish. So, I thought there was a missed opportunity there. And I think that is actually the way to bring Yiddish into the 21st century and get people kind of, not everyone's going to then go do the Duolingo, but get people thinking about, oh, maybe this is something that is relevant. So I would think about mixing in some new stuff too. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to comment, the practice of putting new words to a pre-existing melody, that's called contrafaction. It's very ubiquitously used in Jewish music. You have a melody, you put different words to it. Contrafaction. It's a fancy word for something we always do, and we just didn't know what it was called. So the point is that, I think, well taken, Paul. If we already know the melody, it removes that barrier, and it actually makes it easier to learn a new text, whether it's in English or Yiddish or Hebrew or Ladino or French or German. It doesn't matter. The point is the familiar scaffolding of a melody will actually help with language acquisition or memory of language in a way that, we may feel it's cheesy and we may feel it's inauthentic to do it, but ultimately it's very instructive if we're thinking about it didactically or educationally.
Great. Okay, Samantha, and then Martin, and then unfortunately, I think these are our, Jennifer, your hand went up. So maybe if we could all be very brief, and we'll get in these 3 quick questions. Samantha.
I actually wrote this in the chat, but contrafaction, is that what he said?
Yeah.
So if you're going to use a song, so for the Martin Luther King service that I led last weekend, the song I really wanted to use was James Taylor's Shed a Little Light. And the chorus of it is "Oh Lord, oh Lord, oh Lord," over and over. And originally the music director wanted to rewrite it. And we ended with "Blowing in the Wind," and he wanted to take out "men" from that. For me, fortunately, we ended up on Zoom because of the snow, and I was able to play the video, and the Maccabeats sang the James Taylor song, and so the "Oh Lord" stayed in. I just feel uncomfortable with changing songs like "Blowing in the Wind" and things like that. I feel like people are smart enough to understand, but just, curious about your thought about that.
Yeah, it absolutely depends. I think hearing it from the artist who wrote it, like you could listen to a spiritual sung by Harry Belafonte that has the old lyrics in there. That's one thing, and I think we could appreciate that in its context. I think that the challenge comes when it's coming from our own mouths, right? And that's where words like "Lord" or "baby Jesus" or whatever it might be becomes a little bit problematic. So I think your solution is actually a good one in terms of maybe giving a context for a piece of music, as opposed to needing to get in there and changing ourselves the words. If you can experience the artist performing it, that may be the best way around it.
Thank you. Martin?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that growing up in the UK, we have our oldest Jewish community here is Western Sephardic, And I grew up going to Western Sephardic services and then liberal from the age of 11, which is the equivalent of the American Reform, I believe. And one of the things that we lost when we started attending progressive services was Ladino. Because even though our community in the UK doesn't speak Ladino, we maintain a lot of Ladino songs like Bendigamos. For me, Bendigamos is fundamentally Jewish, even though it's actually not in Ladino, it's in Spanish. But you know, that's kind of this question of what is fundamentally Jewish to a Western Sephardi person is not fundamentally Jewish to a Ashkenazi and not to a Mizrahi, and et cetera, et cetera. And this kind of problem, if you will, of losing authenticity in the progressive Jewish world is a question that I'm always trying to ask myself. How do we maintain that diversity and authenticity and appeal to people who are Sephardic as well as Ashkenazi?
Yeah, and I think, you know, one way to think about it just philosophically is that, as you're alluding to, the Jewish world is very eclectic and diverse. So maybe the authenticity that we're trying to preserve is diversity within our communities, right? So I like framing it that way. Thank you.
Jennifer.
Yes, hello. Sorry to be late. I was in another Zoom meeting from 9 to the second I zoomed in. So happy this is still continuing. And hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
Okay, hi. So, you know, just a couple of comments about what I've heard so far from this really impressive group. One is, you know, in terms of altering or not altering songs, when it's possible, I think would be great to check with the original artist. And so if they are also on board with the idea, if they say no, there's a girl, but I mean, to the extent that it's possible, like a Bob Dylan or whomever, then that artist might also be somebody who's interested in participating in appearances or promoting it. I mean, I think interesting things might come out of having that kind of contact. And rather than our assuming it's not comfortable to do that, it might be interesting to hear from the original singer-songwriters. That was one point. The other is this idea of fundamentally Jewish, which I think is such a great point that Martin made and then that Jonathan followed up with. I think that, at least in my case, because I come from an Ashkenaz, sort of the usual Eastern Europe, Russia area. I shouldn't say the usual, but I mean the one that's often heard and you know, that's often referenced. I love learning about other communities, other Jewish communities, you know, and in Spain and Portugal and Greece and Turkey, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that's of tremendous value, no matter what Jewish strand we come from, because all of it relates to the Jewish diaspora. The fall of the temple in 73 AD, the Inquisition in Spain that ousted, you know, the death knell sounded for all non-Catholics, right? So I think that for a Jewish person of any background, that's a way of piecing together our own history. And I use the word our very broadly, but you know, and Ladino is great because there's so many Spanish speakers in the world. And even though those are not identical languages, there's so much overlap that I think it's a way to bring in a whole other community, you know, Latin American, et cetera, et cetera. And the final point I wanted to make is that that rather than altering what's there in a song, it is still a form of alteration, but rather than changing the original words, I heard a really nice example of someone adding to it. So I went to some local Hanukkah celebration, and they played, you know, the Adam Sandler Hanukkah song, like the one Hanukkah song that everybody kind of likes, you know. And this group kept all the original words, but added additional refrains in Hebrew. And I don't speak much Hebrew at all, but it made me interested in wanting to learn it. You know, so anyway, even though my grandparents spoke Yiddish and not Hebrew really. So anyway, that was just a thought. It's another way to weave it in. It still alters the songs, but again, just without changing the original. So just or changing the original wording. So
Yeah.
that's my piece. Thank you.
Yeah, that's interesting. And there's certainly a Jewish custom surrounding the prayer book where you can add, but you can't take away. So that notion of kind of adding lyrics or adding refrains or whatever, there's certainly a Jewish attitude around that that we could relate to. Yeah, I mean, I guess we're probably done. but a lot of food for thought.
A lot. So thank you so much. And I think that we're going to have to figure out how to do some music, because as long as everyone else is on mute, you can do music through Zoom. And we need to figure out how to do it, because I loved hearing you sing the examples. With our secular, our collaboration, and that will be coming up before Passover this year with Secular Student Alliance, and you don't need to be a student to participate in that. We've had a song leader, and it's been great. And it's my favorite part of any service anyway. So it's something that I think we will try to figure out how to do more of on Zoom, but we really appreciate your time and your knowledge. And I know we're just scratching the surface on it, but it was a great surface scratch. So thank you very much for that. And thanks everyone for being here. And we'll be back in a month, the second Thursday of every month. So see you then. Thanks everybody. Take care.